Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Forest, Fire, and People webinar series brought to you by Colorado State University's Center for Collaborative Conservation and the Institute for Science and Policy, which is a project of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. I am Kristen Eulenbrock and your co-host and the director for the Institute, and I'm so glad that so many of you are joining us this evening. Hello to you if you're joining us on Zoom. Go ahead and open that chat, as you may have heard Nicole saying earlier, and let us know where you're watching from. We love to see all the different locations around Colorado as well as outside of our state here. Before we get started, we do want to acknowledge with respect that I and our guests tonight in Colorado reside on the traditional lands of 48 Native American tribes who now live throughout the American Southwest, Great Plains, and Rocky Mountains, including the Southern Ute and Mountain Ute tribe, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, the Apache, the Comanche, and the Shoshone tribes. We also have a guest joining us this evening located at Southern Methodist University's Department of Anthropology, who would like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Apache, Caddo, Comanche, Coushatta, Tonkawa, Wichita, and affiliated K'iche', Waco, and Tawakani. We honor them as the indigenous land stewards of these places and honor their ancestral and ongoing connections to it. We also want to acknowledge that many people were impacted by these historic fires of 2020, including loss of life, home, and landscapes. All of this while experiencing a really big public health crisis, of course, that is COVID-19, that pandemic. Our hearts really go out to anyone who was affected in any way last year or this year. Tonight is episode 3 of our 4-part series, and we're going to be focusing on the human element tonight. We're going to focus on cultures and identities and values as it relates to where do people live and interact with these fire-prone areas, as well as expectations about fire management and learning from Native American relationships to fire. I do want to provide just a quick reminder that if you have questions for any of our guests tonight, definitely drop those into the chat. We have eyes on them and we want to incorporate as many questions as we can into our discussion. We're also recording this and we have recordings available of our previous 2 episodes if you missed them, as well as a recording of tonight's episode will be available after. Let me go ahead and bring in my co-host and partner into the series of the conversation, John Sanderson, who is the director for the Center for Collaborative Conservation at CSU. Good evening, John. How are you doing?
Hey, Kristen, I'm doing well. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you who have taken time out of your evening to spend it with us. I think we have some fabulous guests tonight, and I'm sure you'll feel the same way in an hour. You know, as Kristen mentioned, today we're going to add some human dimensions to the science and management topics we discussed the last couple of weeks. Cameron Peak Fire that we talked about last week at 209,000 acres, Colorado's largest fire on record, is still going to be in the conversation, but our focus is much broader this week about our relationship with fire, both specifically and generally. Just a reminder that we do have one more episode next Monday, same time, same place. And in this final episode, this is April 12th, next Monday, we'll be talking about the future of Western wildfires. Just before introducing this evening's guest, Kristen and I want to acknowledge and thank the Gates Family Foundation for their financial support for this series. And we also want to thank our partners at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, the Colorado State Forest Service, and the Climate Adaptation Partnership. Believe it or not, all of those organizations have helped us put this together and bring the most interesting and important dimensions of forest and wildfire to all of you. So our guests tonight are Wendy Koenig, Chris Roos, and Heather Hansen. Wendy Koenig is the mayor of Estes Park, Colorado, which many of you know is the gateway community to Rocky Mountain National Park. Wendy has lived in Estes Park most of her life, but she did come down to Fort Collins to get her bachelor's and master's degree at Colorado State University, where I'm sitting. And Wendy also earned a Doctor of Audiology from Central Michigan University. I learned today a little fact that we won't be discussing today, but is really interesting, is that Wendy is also a two-time Olympian. Wendy served as an Estes Park trustee and mayor pro tem for 4 years, from 2013 to 2017. And then she became mayor just last spring, just in time to help the city deal with last year's wildfires. Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you.
Chris Roos is an environmental archaeologist and a professor of anthropology at Southern Methodist University. His primary areas of interest and expertise are, and I love these terms, one area of expertise is human pyrogeography and also behavioral geoarchaeology. We're going to include a couple of links later today to articles that you might be interested in reading on both of those topics, and really fascinating work that Chris does. For more than a decade, he has been directing interdisciplinary research projects on the long-term interactions of human societies, climate, and wildfire in the Southwest US. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
And our third guest is Heather Hansen. Heather is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in newspapers and magazines from San Francisco to Johannesburg. She's a science freak, a history buff, and a lover of public lands who spends as much time as possible away from her desk, hiking in Colorado's mountains. Starting in 2015, Heather spent nearly 2 years looking at wildfire from the inside out with the unique crew at Station 8 in Boulder, Colorado. Just working really close up with that crew there and seeing day to day what they did. And in the process, Heather became a certified wildland firefighter. And then she took this experience, and in 2018, she published Wildfire on the Front Lines with Station 8, this book that I'm going to read from in just a second here. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Great. So we'd love to start by asking each of you to share a few minutes of your thoughts on how we should be thinking or rethinking about our relationships with fire and living with fire in fire-prone areas. So Heather, I thought I'd share just a couple sentences from your book and then ask you to expand on this a little bit. So this is from page 16 in your prologue. Every fire season, we see the same images: heroes fighting fires, victims losing homes, orange flames topping evergreens, and planes streaking the sky with red slurry. After the fire, firefighters are slapped on the back. Generally, some third party is blamed for the burn, and houses are often rebuilt on the same charred footprints. Burn, build, burn, rebuild, and repeat. Wildfire is not a problem to be solved. It's part of the natural cycle of many ecosystems. And then you go on to suggest that we can and should change our attitude about fire. What would be a better attitude?
Thank you so much, John, for taking the time to read that. I think I start by saying I'm a 0-time Olympian, which I think puts me in the minority in Boulder, but puts me in good company on this panel. But I stand by those words even a couple years after writing them. And when we look at 2020, we know it was a terrible year for fire. It was a record-breaking year in some ways. But we have to look at that having already had decades of some precedent in deadly destructive fires. And the crew that I write about in the book is the City of Boulder Wildland Fire Crew at Station 8. And they're actually the only municipal wildland fire crew in the country. And I keep in touch with them still. And since last year was the year that it was, toward the end of the year, late October, I got in touch with the guy who's now the chief of the department. And I asked him just simply what this year has been like for you. And he said, incredible, yet not unexpected. Climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, it's making things harder. Yet we keep doing the same things over and over, waiting and hoping for different results. So I think for a long time, just to give you some perspective, and I can go into the history of fire later on if we want, but fire managers, firefighters, forest ecologists, they've known for a long time that something needs to change, but it hasn't really in any big way. And that's where we come in, the public, and that's where 2020 comes in, I hope, in terms of helping us to pivot from that. And I think starting, as Kristen said, I think we need to take a look at what our values are. What do we care about? What's at stake? And then we have to kind of shift our expectations to meet those values. And we can talk more later, if you like, about what shifting those expectations means in terms of fire adapted communities, resilient landscapes, that sort of thing. But I would start by saying we are in uncharted territory in some ways, but not in others. But this is a good moment to kind of move forward and start to change the way we think about fire.
Thank you, Heather. So Chris, you've worked with members of the Jemez Pueblo in New Mexico, and with your help, we've seen really clearly that, of course, we're not the first people in the western part of this continent we live on that have had to deal with fire, and you've demonstrated that the relationship the Jemez Pueblo has with fire goes back many, many centuries. What are just a couple of key things that your work with tribal members there have taught you about how we should consider anew our relationship with fire?
Sure. I guess I'd probably start by just expressing some humility here that the native knowledge holders, of course, have held on to this knowledge about these environments and the role of fire in these places. And we see this, most vocally in parts of California and in parts of the Southwest, where Native people have been lending us their voice to do this. But I think one of the big takeaways for folks living in the West today is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. People have lived sustainably in these fire-prone environments for centuries or millennia. And if I could build on what Heather said, she had a really great opening statement. Living with fire, living in a world without fire in the West is simply not on the menu. We act like it's our prime choice, but it's not one of the choices on the menu. And we may struggle because we don't know all the choices that populate the menu, but by looking to the Native communities that have been stewards of these lands for since time immemorial, we can start to populate that menu with things that have worked. Which is not to say that we have to turn Boulder into a farming Pueblo community. That's not feasible. That's not realistic. But there are things that we can learn about living with fire, living with smoke, managing fuels and forests, and probably most importantly, finding cultural value in fire itself, right? Rather than something that's just a hazard. Obviously, it is hazardous and it requires our respect. But one thing that my work with folks at Jemez, White Mountain Apache, Hopi, Zuni, is that fire does really good things if it's respected and cared for. And that's something that we could really learn from, is find a way to find our values, like Heather said, and embrace them with the fire that works on these places.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll unpack some of that for sure. Really, really fascinating stuff. So Wendy, then you were mayor and had been mayor only, if I've got my timing right, well, certainly less than a year, maybe 8 months or so, when two fires, Cameron Peak Fire and the East Troublesome Creek Fire, came bearing down on the town of Estes Park, and people were evacuated, and you all had a really scary moment, and a lot of people suffered a lot at that time as well. What has that taught you, or what were you thinking about as that was happening that we might want to consider here about our relationship with fire?
Well, I think it's very important to understand how quickly things changed. And we actually watched the fire burning for a long time. And we had tourists that would drive up into Rocky Mountain National Park just below Trail Ridge Store and watch the fire off in the distance in Wyoming and coming towards us because it was very spectacular. And it wasn't a threat. We kept being told that the fire, when it hit the tundra, it would run out of fuel, and that we really didn't have much to worry about in Estes Park. We did have emergency command center because our northern part of Estes Park is close to the Cameron Peak fire coming through. We were kind of surrounded on 3 sides by fire, and then Boulder had one blow up where we couldn't evacuate using Highway 7 either. So we sat there trusting, and then bam, the wind blew up and the fire actually dumped the ridgeline. It skipped all of the tundra and went, gee, I think I'll settle over here where there's more fuel to fire. We went in Estes Park from, I went downtown to do a McDonald bookstore new ribbon cutting, and I'm looking at the color of the sky is bright orange going, do you people really want to have this ribbon cutting? And the town of Estes Park, interesting, the building was just sitting under the glow of clear blue skies. And so I went ahead and did that. I had to go down in a special mask because the smoke was so thick. And after that, I went to the emergency command center, and that's when everything blew up. And within a matter of 20 minutes, we were in full-blown evacuation. People who had been on alert, all of a sudden needed to get out of their homes. And I think we need to understand that fire is not predictable necessarily because of all of the other impacts. And that when you're given an alert, people need to put their possessions in their car and actually be ready to go. And like human beings, we procrastinate. And so a lot of people were separated, went down different canyons. We had to wait for emergency officers from other communities to come up and help work the traffic lights to keep the flow of tourists and residents moving out of Estes Park. So we learned quite a few lessons as far as what does it mean to be on alert and be ready to evacuate a large population. Some things I think that we're of course working with the town and the fire district and local watershed coalitions. And because we're surrounded by national park as well as forest service lands, we're working with all of those organizations to see how we can do a better job of keeping people safe and doing more master plans. We're also troubleshooting our fire plan that we had in place to see what would happen. So I think being ready is really very valuable to people.
Thank you. Let me pick up on what I think all 3 of you start to talk about here, which is, of course, the relationships of people to fire, to their environment, to their communities. And I want to start back with Heather. And some of this may be a little one-off between each 3 of you, but we've got some big overarching thematic questions that we're going to ask you. But Heather, I actually want you to provide us and our guests with a little bit of your thoughts through the lens of our wildland firefighters, our frontline responders, and that experience that they have, which I'm assuming is probably not well understood from those of us who do not know or work or have a relationship with the folks who are there to potentially drop in and keep our lives safe, keep our property safe, among other ways. So, from your experience of working with them, from your own experience, what is not understood about the role that they play and the risk that they take when it comes to managing wildfires? What is it that we should understand that you don't think we maybe quite have our finger on?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we do have this image of the kind of sweaty, gritty, possibly superhuman wildland firefighter. As John mentioned when he was reading part of the introduction to the book, that these images that we see over and over again, and we think we have a sense of who they are, and we do in part. You know, they are well-trained, they are strong, and we can talk about, you know, some of the tests that they have to go through, you know, including physical tests in order to be able to do what they do. But they're also human. And I think that part of what I spend some time on in the book is about their internal and their external expectations. We have a lot of external expectations coming from communities, and either from, you know, wanting to have their homes protected, or, you know, any of us wanting to have some of those resources that we value protected, if that's, you know, a trailhead where we like to go hike, or that's, you know, a watershed, or whatever. But they also have these internal expectations. You know, they generally are helpers. You know, they want to be able to fulfill those expectations. And we've come into a fire environment now in which that's becoming increasingly difficult, almost impossible in a lot of cases, when either homes are not defensible because a fire is just moving, as Mayor Koenig said, kind of too unpredictably, or you know, the picture is just changing too quickly. So I think expectations, again, that's kind of where I started, but I would say again, we have to think about where they are coming from in terms of wanting to do a job, wanting to do it well, but also wanting to go home to their families. And sometimes the price of what we consider valuable is too big a price to pay to kind of uphold that. So that's part of the conversation around values and expectations that we can talk a little bit more about. But they do pay the ultimate price sometimes. You know, we see wildland firefighters who die on the fire line every year. And we also see, and late last year, one US Forest Service spokesperson alluded to this, that we saw an increasing number of frontline responders, particularly in fire, taking their own lives because they couldn't live up to those expectations. So I think we need to, in the process of taking a step back and looking at our values and our expectations, looking at the challenges that they face as fire seasons get longer, sometimes imperceptibly longer. They're just year-long affairs in some places, and more taxing. You know, is it safe for them to be there? Where is it safe for them to be there? And why do we want them there? Ultimately, I think is an important question.
I think I want to stay on this expectations thing, because I think all three of you can speak to that a little bit. So maybe let me just pop this over to Chris. You know, what are the expectations from some of your research? You start to talk a little bit about menus of choices in essence, right? But I think part of that comes down to a different view of expectations, right? That fire is here and it's a natural part of our ecosystem, where I think Heather was alluding to these expectations that we see fire, homeowners, people who live, you know, in the area, and it frightens people. It wants to put them out. We were trying to protect a home. We're trying to protect, you know, land. So maybe provide your perspective on what she was talking about with the idea of expectations.
Sure. Well, just to use the ancestral Jemez landscape as kind of a context. So this is a landscape in northern New Mexico where about 12.5 large villages and small towns of farmers existed for several centuries. And they were using fire in agriculture and hunting and manipulating wild plants, basically for purposes. They were trying to achieve a goal using very small patches of fire all over the place, all over their landscape. And so they saw a benefit from fire use for sure. But they were also harvesting fuels, taking wood off the landscape to burn in their fireplaces at home, which impacted fire behavior and fire intensity. And so you would think, and we certainly imagine, that the landscape around the homes and the agricultural fields would have been one with relatively low fire risk, widely spaced trees with high canopies, little kind of low density fuel on the surface, always kind of broken up by a recently burned patch. But even with that, the big pueblos were fire-wise communities. That we went and looked for evidence of the forest around these villages, and there were no living trees around them for up to 2 football fields. And so they had really fireproofed the landscape, even though they were doing lots of the things that we think of as the valuable things for reducing fire hazard. That characterized the landscape around them, but they also took care of their domestic space and made it fireproof effectively. Imagine all the thousands of feet trampling fine fuels and no big trees, no trees of any sort. But we know that fires did burn within a half kilometer or so of these towns. We've got fire scarred trees that show that this happened. And so there was lots of fire in and around these landscapes, but they also covered their bases and made sure that their homes were protected in the event that the unexpected happened, the unpredictability that Wendy was getting at.
Wendy, what's expectations of those up there in Estes Park, right? I love that area. I'm up there all the time. And, we were talking before tonight about, this movement of homes, right? Closer and closer, and already in, the geography there and the forest landscape there. So what are people's expectations about their homes that they live in your community?
Well, I think that we have to look at lots of pieces when we talk about expectations. And part of that is, how do the policies of a national park and how they deal with pine beetle kill that came in affect those expectations of how safe your property is going to be? And how do insurance companies affect those expectations, because they come in and have us do our fire mitigation around our properties to keep the property safer. So we don't just let things sit idly and assume that we will be okay. There's actually a lot of active intervention that goes on in Estes Park. And I believe that now the federal lands are going to look a little differently at all of the pine beetle kill areas, because our ponderosa trees have a very shallow root system. And when they catch on fire, the remaining tree, if it hasn't exploded, just sits there for 50 years. You can go up on top of Trail Ridge and see fires that happened in Forest Canyon years and years ago. So I think that the homeowners that live here, when I was a child, we didn't go above what was called the blue line. I think I talked about that before, but technology allows that blue line to go up the mountain a little bit farther. And neighborhoods have private water systems in some places that don't have any way to fight fires. So those individual neighborhoods now that are not on the regular water system for the town, one of them, Prospect Mountain, will be putting in a very large water tank so that they'll be able to have fire mitigation via the Estes Park water system. So they've moved off their private water system. So I think that not living in the mountains is not an option, but living with wisdom that you learn over time and utilizing different agencies to allow us to do reasonable mitigation in the area without destroying the environment and the natural species that live here. It's a balancing walk that we take. We also used to have 2,000 people in Estes Park year round. We haven't grown a lot. We have 6,000. Well, 6,000 people aren't the number of houses that you see in Estes Park, because many of them are second homes. Our tourism rate has grown to 4.5 million people coming through Rocky Mountain Estes Park. And when I was younger, we had 20,000 and the season was 4 months long. And now we're always extending the season. So one thing that I would like to see is an education program in the school districts for families on really what is fire. And we have so many kids that play games on the internet where things get blown up with fire and things, but it kind of blends reality with imagination, and they don't see the end result of what can happen. So I really think we need to continue to educate the youth and families. As a community, the other thing we do is try to create policies that balance visitor wants and what's safe in our community. So it's quite a challenge.
Wendy, I think that's a really interesting point you make about the video games, and I'm struck a little bit by the language that we use around fires and managing them. It's usually firefighting, right? So it's an adversarial relationship from the get-go. And Chris, you've spent a lot of time thinking about and you mentioned earlier finding value in fire. One thing I would love to have you speak to is how so we're in a situation right now where we have more than a century of post settler European forest management, which, as you've pointed out, is very different from what you have studied before the Europeans arrived. Can you tell us a little bit about, I don't know, maybe starting with the laws that we implemented, one of them being the Weeks Act, 1911, right? Did I catch that? The Weeks Act, which actually made it illegal for the tribes in New Mexico to implement these practices. Can you share a little bit about that dynamic and then your perception of what then transpired over the 20th century with this adversarial relationship that we maintain with fire?
It's really interesting. The place of Native peoples in debates about fire management, forest management, and policy go back to the late 19th century when Gifford Pinchot and the creators of the National Forest Reserve System saw fire as a threat to America's timber reserves and saw American Indians as the primary source for that, or people in general, but the history being connected to Native peoples. And they were juxtaposed with policymakers, including the legendary John Wesley Powell, right, the guy who led the expedition down the Colorado River, mapping the Grand Canyon. In that journey, he made a number of observations about fires in Utah and in Colorado that were Native American fire management. And at least initially when he came back, his advocacy was for what they called then light burning, what got pejoratively called Paiute forestry out of Powell's work. And so this drove the policy debate about whether or not this should be managed with fire, like the Indians did, or if it should be kept out and managed with European scientific forestry techniques, as Pinchot and his acolytes brought. And ultimately they won for really interesting historical reasons. But then this gets codified in laws, and for several decades thereafter, right, the policy exclusively is suppression. And then eventually, policy starts to incorporate the natural role of fire, but rejecting the role of Native Americans. And then really, then again, here in the 21st century, greater recognition, partly because of Native peoples really speaking up about their desire to get fire back onto the landscape and return it as a positive force.
Heather, you were nodding there as Chris was speaking. He said a couple of things that resonated with you, I think. Can you, how does what he was I mean, I'm curious how the firefighters in Unit 8 think about these things, and what's your experience there of that engagement with firefighting versus or in companionship with fire as a tool that we use.
Yeah, the story, the history of fire, with at least from the white settler's perspective, is one, I think, with more twists and turns than we realize sometimes. Just as Chris was saying, not everybody was a total dunce about either how fire could benefit the forest or the role of forests themselves. People in the 19th century understood they needed to protect watersheds. They needed it for biodiversity to some extent, and also even for recreation they talked about at that point. And we even had John Muir in Yosemite in I think it was 1895, a Sierra Club meeting, saying how important fire was to the health of forests, particularly in Yosemite. And we've kind of gone in and out of that understanding. When more people came west, there came this idea of the permanence of the forests, not just because of they thought that it was wasteful that they burned, but they actually thought it was in some cases a moral issue. Bad habits, loose morals, some of the terminology that people used at that point. And then we kind of moved through the big burn era of 1910, and more fire intersecting more people led ultimately to this 10 a.m. policy, which Chris alluded to, though not by that name. And that was the policy that the Forest Service had to try to control or extinguish a fire by 10 a.m. the day after it was reported. And then we go through World War II, and this links to your mention of kind of the war or firefighting, a terminology that began to develop around then, because there was a saying, careless matches aid the axis, I think is how it went. And preventing fire really became like kind of a patriotic duty. And then we get stories about Bambi and the forest burning down, and Smokey Bear, which I'm sure everybody knows. And then preventing fire becomes a kind of cultural imperative. Then the U.S. Forest Service is more the U.S. Fire Service. It kind of takes on this, tongue-in-cheek name over time. And then we come to the 60s and 70s and more ecological environmental awareness. People understand more about the importance of fire in the landscape. But then we have setbacks to that understanding. 1988, there's a huge fire in Yellowstone, and the whole country watches what was a pretty well managed fire, take a turn and burn down America's first national park. So this kind of coincides. I don't know how much we'll talk about climate today. I know we talked about it somewhat in the past sessions, but this setback in terms of ecological understanding kind of coincides with the end of climate normalcy. So we kind of follow this arc with some dips and rises in, no fire thanks. And we're kind of still living with the consequences of that. So I think that hopefully answers your question, but tell me what I missed.
I mean, I thought that was good, the no fire thanks thing. And I'm almost thinking that ties back in a little bit to Wendy, what started this conversation about some of the education. But Wendy, you're dealing with almost two different types of populations or public perception in essence, right? You have the communities and residents of Estes Park, and then you have this 4.5 million tourists who come in who, some of them potentially live in forested areas and deal with wildfires and the rest, but, there's going to be folks who aren't used to wildfires. So, this narrative that Chris and Heather have started out with, the history and where we currently are in public perception about the role of fire, how do you manage those two things from both from an education point, right? You talk about education in schools, but there's this tourism education piece that I don't sure, how do we do that?
We work with the National Forest and very closely actually with Rocky Mountain National Park to see what type of messaging we can coordinate Sometimes it's our signage as you come down. If we're high fire danger, we have electronic signs that let people know that certain precautions that they need to make as they come into town. Some of our hotels and motels will put up flyers or let people know what the fire danger is. The other thing that we have to manage is expectation for housing. And I think I was talking about when we got together to organize this, that we've actually had vacation rentals. They all want fire pits, and because they want to roast marshmallows and have hot dogs and sit around the campfire, but they get up and go in the house and forget that they have to put out the fire that they started in the fire ring, even if there's messages there. So when you have people come and visit that are from a concrete world, they don't even turn off the lights in the house when they go to bed at night, which actually is hard on the wildlife that come out at night because they live in a place where the lights are always on. And so we have to coordinate with messaging really with those people. The Park Service and some of the Forest Service departments also host educational seminars during the summer that people can go into the visitor center at Rocky Mountain National Park and learn some things about this. So there are materials that are provided, and then you just have to realize when people get very enthusiastic and excited, sometimes their brains go out the window because they're seeing such beautiful, beautiful things around them. And so we just have to be alert, and all of us try to work with that population.
Wendy, if I could pick up on that education piece a little bit more, and maybe to Chris and Heather as well. I don't know who wants to pick up on this, but we've in the last couple of weeks, and then here today, we've talked a little bit about defensible space and then forest management, but then there seems to persist this concept of like the agencies are going to take care of that, right? Heather, you spoke to that a little bit, and maybe even a little worse, like why aren't they taking care of it? Like as in casting blame on particularly the U.S. Forest Service, who spends on the order of $2 billion a year on big fires or big years like the one we just had. I mean, Heather, you've thought a lot about this, I can see, but how do we own this problem more collectively? So we've talked about how it gets down to values, but it's also individual landowners, whether you live in Boulder or up in the foothills, whether you're, resident of town, maybe you're not exposed to fire at all, but you've experienced the smoke. And then there are these public agencies. So it's, we heard in the last couple of weeks that we need to own this really broadly as a society. How do we start moving in that direction?
Yeah, I think picking up on where I left off in the last comment, fire suppression is still our go-to, even though the Forest Service doesn't have a 10 a.m. policy anymore, but it's our go-to for different reasons. I mean, what happened in the time that we suppressed fire was that a whole bunch of people moved into where there are places where there was no fire, or they thought there was no fire. So what's happened over time is the wildland-urban interface, what we know as the WUI, has gotten, quite substantial. People have thought fire doesn't happen here, and we're realizing that it does because of the buildup of fuel and because of the change in climate and all the other factors that have come together. So I think we start owning it by understanding that we have kind of, without laying any blame on people who, built homes or, bought homes there, maybe not understanding that history, but we have to kind of own the fact that we have intruded in a place where fire has always been, and now we're in a situation where it's getting, fires are getting bigger, faster, harder to fight, and we're continuously in the path of that. So I think understanding kind of where we've come from and the situation that we find ourselves in is part of the next step. And educating ourselves, as both Mayor Koenig and Chris have said, understanding what it means to live with fire, and what it means to visit a place that has fire. And I guess if we can't rely on people to educate themselves, then kind of taking the steps that Mayor Koenig was talking about as well, trying to educate them and, not just Smokey Bear's message, save the forest, but save the firefighter. We need to understand really what is at stake. And there are a lot of values at stake, and the number one is life.
I want to pick up on that, or Chris, please go ahead if you have something to add before I.
Oh, no, I was just going to suggest that there are probably a couple scales at which we can do this in terms of getting people involved. I mean, I know, I'm sure that Heather has experience with this too, that two of the big hurdles for getting good fire out in these places is the smoke hazard and the thinning that needs to happen because of the century of fire suppression. What to do with those small diameter trees that are not generally economically viable products. I mean, so in Jemez, those small diameter trees were not an issue because they were all being burned in people's fireplaces. Well, they can burn in people's fireplaces again today. If the communities that are in real need, whether they are poorer rural communities or the Native American communities that are still nearby, can use those. And then, community leaders like Wendy are really ideally situated for this in terms of bridging the connection between maybe the agencies dealing with this at a landscape scale and her community members about the smoke that is inevitably going to be there, especially with 100 years of fire suppression. There's a lot of fuels. And so for the next few decades, even if we get all this good fire out there, it's going to be really smoky, but it's still better in that quotient than it is in the big mega fire quotient. And Wendy can be the bridge, and people like Wendy can be the bridge between the community, and it's going to be the most engaged folks, but that's okay, right? That's a start, and that helps to deal with the air quality issues that hang up so many prescribed burning projects.
And just taking off on that, you may have had another question for me, but one of the things that we do in the national parks and the forests, if they do have a burn program, which they do in very populated areas of the national park, they build great big mounds of burnable fuel, and then we do it in the winter. So there's snow on the ground, there's fewer tourists. The air is pretty fresh in the winter up here. And that's when we choose to do some of the fire mitigation, because if things get out of control, we have a good blanket of snow on the ground. And so I appreciate that approach, because it is considering what happens. In Denver and Boulder, you guys get an inversion and the smog just stays down there. And we usually have it blow away, sometimes to Boulder and Denver. But we want to be cognizant of the fact that we do impact life in other areas, as well as the watershed. We haven't talked about the watershed, but we're very fortunate. We're kind of at the headwaters of the watershed. Some of these fires did impact our watershed, but we want to be sure the things that we do, we're always taking into account our neighbors at lower elevation from where we are. And so it is a challenge for us. I do feel that society is becoming, because we have so many people, where there's less and less self-responsibility taken. And the school districts have gone to more group thought and group think. And so if someone in the group suggests that it's not their responsibility. A lot of people go along with that. And I'm hoping that schools will realize there's very definite areas of being environmentally responsible, that the kids need to be exposed to education on what self-responsibility means when you're out hiking by yourself. Heather, you like to hike, go up in the mountains by yourself, but I'm sure that with your fire background, you're very concerned about what you do when you're out there. And so we need a population that begins to take a little more responsibility and not just look at the big governing towns and policymakers to take care of things for them. It's not fair to the wild firefighters either. There's only so much you can do when the fire takes off. There's just not a lot you can do. You have to wait till you can control some ground out in front of it to change its behavior. So thank you.
This is great. We're coming up on about 9 minutes left, and there's been a interesting little conversation happening in the chat here that I want to just bring up and have you all reflect on, because a few people of our guest comments actually kind of interrelate. But they kind of come back to some of this education a little bit, I think. And one of our guests was talking about the fact that his uncle was a logger back in the 1950s and taught him about how, you know, when a fire releases seeds in the forest and how this kind of regenerates the forest and that natural cycle. But then of course, asking a park ranger about it and not really being given the answer. And so a lot of this comes down to, you know, other people are asking about current education and classes and things. And we've talked a little bit about that, but you know, this comes back to what we've talking about, which is the current mode of thinking and potentially, you know, challenges with people not really understanding their environment, their interconnectedness potentially with nature. So I'm going to pull in a third person's comment here too, about the role between how Native Americans and Indigenous peoples' relationship to nature, and sometimes the disconnect that European civilizations have between us versus nature. So I want to just kind of, that's not really a question, that's just a few of our comments from our guests here that I think really are hitting at some of what we're talking about. And I'm wondering if there's any reflections on some of those thoughts that have been shared by our guest here, whether that's through the education or that interconnectedness that we have, and how do we think about our role and our position within nature. Heather, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree with explaining better the role of good fire and prescribed burns. Some of the education, I guess, I try to do in the book is taking people through the process, at least in Boulder, of planning a prescribed burn and explaining how exhaustive a process that is, and how air quality regulations and various other legal requirements are in place. And in the case of Station 8, you know, there would even be one member of the crew who, if they were the burn boss, the person in charge of that prescribed burn, they lived in a trailer on the site of where the burn was going to be so that they could monitor the environmental and atmospheric conditions. Like, they get very, very granular, and they're very reticent to drop a match, so to speak, on a prescribed burn. Because of all of the perceived values that are at risk. And they take all of that very seriously. And in some ways that makes it too confining to be able to do the prescribed burning at the scale that we need to. But at the same time, I think if people understood better that, you know, their firefighters are not going out there and kind of, you know, licking their finger and holding it up to the wind and saying, yeah, I guess let's go for it and see what happens. Like, it doesn't mean there's no risk. There's always going to be risk. There's no such thing as a 100% safe fire in a wildland area. But they are very well planned, very well managed, and probably another part of that education piece. And I think they do this as well as they can in Boulder, is to educate people. You know, they'll go out in an area, they'll talk to people on trails, you know, and say, this is what we're planning and this is why. and they will get some resistance. People will say, why do you have to do this? This is where I do my workout every day, and you're kind of ruining that, or I'm worried about my house, or I really love the trees in this area. It gives people kind of a chance to explain what their values are, and for those to be understood and respected, but to be able to say, I hear that, but this is where we're coming from. And the air quality of a prescribed burn is not great necessarily, but the air quality of the types of fires that we had last summer and last fall was far worse. We're beginning to see the implications of that with several studies that have come out of California just recently, about emergency room visits and particulate matter in particular, and how that affects small children. So we have to look at the whole picture. And I think that wildland firefighters are kind of doing their best to do that. But I think the rest of us, as a science journalist, I could be doing, an even better job trying to do that. So I'm chatting and I'm watching the clock. So let me shut up and give somebody else a chance to talk.
Oh, thank you, Heather. We're getting close to the end. I'd love to end on thoughts from both Chris and Wendy. So, Chris, because you've got this deep historical perspective through the work you've done with several of our tribal nations, and Wendy, because you're presiding over a town that's last summer at least was right in the epicenter of all of this. But we've talked about the need for kind of a deep reflection on values and cultural change, which is hard and takes time. But then also, Chris, you mentioned, and Heather did as well, these kind of very practical concerns around smoke and having to do something with the small trees when you're doing the thinning, and all of this costs money, by the way. And so, Chris, what given those challenging things, of thinking about this metaphorical menu you described and the choices we can and need to make off of that menu, where do you find the hope? Where do you find the path forward as most promising?
Well, yeah. So I guess looking backwards and looking at traditional societies today as well, and cultural burning in California, cultural burning in Australia, it's that this can be done, right? That these landscapes can really benefit. And some of the great work in Australia shows that patchworks of lots and lots of small burns really enhance biodiversity, including the game that the Aboriginal people are hunting, right? They're actually better off in the places where people are hunting them because they're part of this managed landscape. And so I think I take that as a real positive. And then I'd also, I guess, look forward really briefly and think that we can engage many of those same Native peoples today with a modern day civilian conservation corps for fire, a civilian fire corps that was year round, at scale, involving the people whose lands we're talking about. And we can do this, we can do it now, and move into a future in which we all kind of embrace fire as part of our life.
Super, thank you. Wendy, last word to you then. So, what gives you hope that you're not going to have to face another harrowing summer like you did last fall?
Well, I think what gives me hope is we didn't lose any fires, and we learned a lot about fire management from this whole affair. We need to realize and understand that what works in one area, like in Washington State, doesn't have any rational reality to working in Rocky Mountain National Park. There are different trees and different needs, different vegetation. And I think what gives me hope is we were given a second chance. It didn't get to Estes Park and come on through. So I think everyone is on high alert and we're all working together. We'll release a report in May about what we learned from all of this. And I'm hoping that then we'll be able to implement that.
Great. Well, I think we should wrap it up there. Heather, did you have one more word of hope that you wanted to chime in with?
One more word of hope is that it's not a mystery. We know what we need to do. We would be much worse off if we didn't. but we do have a path forward, and I'm hopeful that we can do that.
Right, and back to what something you said at the beginning is we can't keep waiting for something to change. So kind of that, hopefully tonight's episode provided folks with some new ways of thinking about this issue. This is a really big, complicated topic through a lot of different lenses. So we never completely do it 100% justice with any hour that we have with the brilliant minds that we bring on. But I always walk away feeling a little bit more informed and thinking just a little bit more critically about these issues. So a huge thank you to our guests tonight. Thank you, Chris and Wendy and Heather, so much for your time, for sharing your expertise and your perspective with both John and myself, as well as all of our great guests that tuned in tonight. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As John said at the beginning, this was episode 3 of 4. So episode 4 is next week, Monday at 5 p.m. Mountain Time. We'll be back here talking about the future of Western fires. And we've got a great lineup of guests next week as well too. So hopefully we'll see you all then. Nicole dropped some links into the chat. We'll also share some follow-up with you in an email afterwards, including a link to Heather's book, Chris's paper, as well as some other reading resources. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Stay well, stay healthy, and hopefully you have a nice rest of your night. We'll see you next week. Take care.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.